Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of people who watch these videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy this kind of content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel more than you think. Please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Your interaction helps these stories reach more people. Thank you for being here. My name is Marcus, and I've been doing search and rescue work in the Appalachian Mountains for about 7 years. I'm a volunteer on a team that covers the eastern ridge of the Blue Ridge, mostly North Carolina, but when things get ugly, we get pulled into Tennessee or Virginia. I work construction during the week, roofing, framing, whatever keeps the bills paid, and when the phone buzzes with a call-out, I drop the hammer, grab the pack I keep behind the driver's seat, and I go. This isn't a hobby. It's not a thrill. It's not about helping people find themselves or any of that brochure language. It's a job that gets into your bones because you see the same mistakes over and over. People underestimate terrain. They overestimate their bodies. They treat weather like it's a decoration, like a gray sky can't kill you. They go 10 miles deep with a bottle of water and a granola bar because the trail looked easy on an app. They think the mountains are a theme park. Most of the time, the mountains let them go. Sometimes they don't. I don't tell campfire stories. I don't blame spirits or curses or old folklore. I've heard all of it. I've heard the locals talk about lights in the tree line, voices mimicking loved ones, strange figures on ridgelines. I've sat in diners at 2 a.m. while a waitress with nicotine fingers leaned on a counter and told me about something her grandfather swore he saw. I nod. I drink my coffee. I go back outside and do my work. My work is maps and radio traffic and grid assignments and protocol. My work is taking a trailhead that looks harmless at noon and turning it into a search operation before dusk eats the last of the light. My work is calling a name into trees that don't answer. The first time the pattern showed itself to me, I didn't recognize it as a pattern. I thought it was an outlier. I thought it was a one-off, a weird case we'd talk about for a month and then file away under unresolved, which happens more than the public understands. There are missing persons cases in these mountains that never make the news. There are recoveries we don't advertise. There are reports that stay inside a drawer because the family asked, because the sheriff asked, because everyone involved agreed that certain details didn't help anyone sleep. If you do this work long enough, you learn there's the official version and the version you tell yourself in the dark. The call that started it came in on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I remember because I was on a roof when my phone vibrated against my thigh, and the wind was cold enough to keep my fingers numb even through gloves. I was stripping shingles. My crew was laughing about something I didn't hear. When I looked at the screen and saw Sarah's name, I knew it wasn't a social call. Sarah is our coordinator. She's the person who keeps everything moving. She's the one who makes sure radios are charged, that everyone has the current maps, that the sheriff's department knows where we are. She's not the type to panic. So when her text came through with only the basics, I didn't expect it to hit me as hard as it did. Missing hiker. Male. 32. Last seen on Hawkville Ridge Trail around noon yesterday. Didn't return to vehicle. Girlfriend reported missing this morning. Staging at trailhead 1500. I told my foreman I had to go. He didn't argue. Everyone on that crew knew I did SAR. They didn't love it when I left mid-job, but they respected it. I climbed down, threw my tools in the truck, and drove with that familiar tightness in my chest. Part adrenaline, part dread, part a ritual my body had learned. Late October in the Appalachians is deceptive. It looks like a postcard. Leaves turning red and orange, air crisp, visibility good. But once the sun drops, temperatures slide fast. Mid-50s and the day becomes low 40s in a couple hours. And if you're wet, if you're hurt, if you're lost, that's the line between a bad night and a fatal one. I got to the trailhead just before 3. Parking lot was half full. Sarah SUV, a couple of pickups, and one sheriff's department unit parked near the entrance like it owned the place. The girlfriend was there too, sitting on the tailgate of her car with her face in her hands. Families look at you like you're the last rung of hope, and you can't carry that into the woods with you. You have to stay clean. You have to stay procedural. Sarah had a map spread out across her hood, held down by a rock at each corner. She looked up when she saw me and gave a small nod. No wasted motion, no chatter. Ethan Cole, she said. Experienced hiker, according to her. Comes up here a couple times a month. Same loop, same ridge. He knows the area, which makes it worse. I didn't argue. When experienced hikers go missing, it's rarely because they forgot how to read a blaze. It's because something shifted. Weather, injury, a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and turned into a trap an hour later. We had 6 volunteers already staged. Sarah divided us into 3 teams of 2. She assigned me to Greg. Greg was in his 50s, quiet. The kind of guy who looked like he'd been carved out of old wood. He'd been doing SAR longer than me. He never overtalked. He never dramatized. He carried himself like someone who had learned not to waste energy on emotions in the field. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm and brief. We got the northern section. It was a steep stretch of ridge that overlooked a valley so deep it swallowed sound. That area is rough. Loose rock, laurel thickets you can push through without bleeding, drop-offs that don't look like drop-offs until you're on top of them. If Ethan had slipped, if he'd gone off trail, if he'd gotten pinned in that mess, it would be easy to miss him. At 3:30, Greg and I started in. We did the normal checks first. Radio test, channel confirmation, GPS on and tracking, paper map accessible, headlamps accessible. You don't turn a headlamp on in daylight if you can help it. You preserve batteries because you don't know what your night will look like. Our radios crackled with Sarah's voice. She was setting the cadence. Check-ins every 30 minutes. Report any sign immediately. No hero work. If one of us got hurt, the search became a rescue for us too. The trail was well marked at first, winding up through oak and pine. Leaves were thick underfoot, a dry, crisp layer that muffled steps. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But I wasn't looking at the color. I was scanning for disturbance. Broken branches, a scuff in the dirt, a piece of fabric that didn't belong, a wrapper, a footprint. Anything that said a human being had moved through here recently. We called his name every few minutes. You don't shout like you're trying to win a contest. You call steady loud enough to carry, then you listen. You give the woods space to answer. Ethan Cole. Search and rescue. Nothing. The first thing that struck me was the lack of birds. I noticed it about 40 minutes in. Normally, even late afternoon, you'll hear something. Jays, crows, small rustling. Here, there was just absence. No wind either, which made the silence worse. Our breathing sounded loud. The crunch of leaves under our boots sounded intrusive. I didn't mention it to Greg. Silence happens. Weather shifts. Animals go quiet if a predator's nearby. There were explanations I'd used before, and I used them again because I needed them. Around 5, we reached the edge of our grid. The trail narrowed. The terrain steepened, and the ridge fell away into a ravine choked with rhododendron. Greg stopped and checked his GPS against the map. His finger traced our line. If he went off trail here, he said, pointing down the slope, he could have slid into that ravine. We both looked down. It was the kind of slope that didn't look steep until you tried to stand on it. The leaf cover hid rocks. The rocks hid gaps. The gaps hid the places that break ankles. We left the trail and started down. Progress slowed immediately. When you're off trail in that terrain, everything becomes a negotiation. You test each step. You use trees for balance. You keep your weight centered. You don't rush, even when time is running out, because injury in the ravine is a cascade. You break your leg, you can't move, you can't get out. And now there are 2 missing persons instead of 1. About halfway down, I saw a flash of blue in the leaves. I stopped and raised a hand to Greg. He froze. I pointed. 10 feet to our left, snagged on a branch, was a strip of blue nylon. I worked my way over carefully and pulled it free. Torn, frayed, about 6 inches long. It could have been from a jacket. It could have been a pack cover. It was too generic to be definitive, but it didn't belong to the woods. Greg leaned in, eyes narrowed. Could be his, he said, and his voice was flat, but his posture tightened. That was the moment it shifted from routine search to probable location. I radioed Sarah with our position using the coordinates from Greg's GPS. I kept my tone professional. You don't put emotion on the radio. You transmit facts. Base, this is Team North 1. We've located a torn piece of blue nylon snagged mid-slope on the North Ridge drop. Possible clothing or pack material. Coordinates follow. Sarah acknowledged, and I heard the subtle change in her voice. Not panic, just focus. Copy. Good work. Continue search in that area. We're sending another team toward you. Maintain check-in. We went deeper. At the bottom of the slope, the ravine narrowed and thickened into a wall of rhododendron and laurel. It wasn't a place you'd choose to enter unless you had to. The canopy overhead cut the light down early. By the time we reached it, the world under the branches was already dim. I pulled out my flashlight and didn't turn it on yet. I just held it, thumb ready. Greg did the same. We moved forward, pushing into the thicket, and the branches grabbed at our jackets like hands. We called again. Ethan. Ethan Cole. Can you hear me? Nothing. 10 minutes in, I turned on my light. The beam caught wet leaves, glossy bark, and the close wall of plants. Visibility dropped to 3 feet. This was where you miss things if you get sloppy. This was where you step over someone because you didn't angle your light correctly. And then I saw it. A shoe. Just sitting there on the ground, half covered by leaves like someone had tried to bury it in a hurry. Brown leather hiking boot, still laced. I knelt and picked it up. It was damp but not soaked. Not old. Not the kind of boot you'd expect to find discarded. Greg stepped closer and stared. He didn't have to say anything. The look on his face was enough. People don't just lose their boots. I radioed it in. Sarah asked one question. Girlfriend, confirm brown boots? I heard her flipping pages, typing, doing the coordinator work. Then, confirmed. That matches. Now it wasn't just a search. It was a track. We moved slower, scanning the ground for the other boot, for a trail, for any sign of a fall. The problem was leaf cover. It erases evidence. It fills footprints. It hides drag marks. We pushed through another section of brush and Greg called out, low and sharp. Marcus. I got something. I forced my way toward his voice, branches scraping my arms. We emerged into a small clearing, maybe 15 feet across. It looked unnatural. Not because it was perfectly round or manicured, but because it was too clean. The brush had been cleared back. The ground was less cluttered, like someone had created a pocket. In the center of that pocket was a backpack. It was upright, leaning against a rock. Next to it, a water bottle, a folded paper map, a pair of sunglasses. All of it arranged neatly, like a display. My first thought was relief. Gear means proximity. Gear means the person was here. Gear means you're close. My second thought was that something about it made my skin tighten. You can't always name that feeling when it hits. You just know it's there. Like your body is reading a threat your brain hasn't processed yet. I knelt and opened the pack. Inside was normal. A basic first aid kit, energy bars, a headlamp, spare socks. I found a wallet, opened it. Driver's license, Ethan Cole. I looked up at Greg. The clearing seemed quieter than the ravine had been. Even our breathing sounded wrong. This is his stuff, I said. But why is it like this? Greg didn't answer. His light was moving over the trees. Slow, deliberate. I followed his beam and saw the bark. Scratches, fresh, deep, deliberate. I walked to the nearest trunk and ran my gloved hand over them. They were at about the same height on every tree, 5 feet or so off the ground. Not random gouges, not bear marks, not the shallow scrapes of a branch in wind. They circled the clearing, tree after tree, the same kind of scoring, like something had been dragged across the bark with purpose. Greg whispered it, like saying it louder would make it real. What the hell is this? I didn't have an answer. I radioed Sarah and told her what we'd found. The pack, the items, the license, the clearing, the scratches. There was a pause on the line. Not long, but long enough for me to notice. Then Sarah's voice came back tighter. Copy. Do not disturb the arrangement any further. Mark location. Continue search. Another team will retrieve the items. You have 30 minutes of light. Use caution. We left the clearing and kept moving, because that's what we do. We follow the logic of our work even when the world stops obeying it. The ravine widened as we went, opening into a shallow area where a small creek trickled through mud and stones. The water was barely running, more a wet line than a stream. I was about to suggest we turn back. Dark was falling fast, when my light caught something in the mud. Footprints. Fresh, sharp-edged, bare feet. I knelt, and the chill that went through me had nothing to do with temperature. A grown man barefoot, walking in mud in late October, deep in a ravine. The prints were deep, as if whoever made them was moving slowly, placing full weight down. Not running, not panicking. Walking. The prints led upstream into a narrow gap between two boulders that stood close together like a doorway. Greg leaned in, studying the stride. "Why would he?" He started, then stopped. It wasn't a question with an answer. We should have turned back. We should have marked it and waited for daylight and more manpower. But the prints were there, and the clock was ticking, and every part of SAR training drills the same thing into you. Follow the most recent sign of life. Greg looked at me once. He didn't need to speak. The decision was in his posture. We followed. The gap between the boulders was tight. I turned sideways, pack scraping stone. My headlamp stayed off. I didn't want to waste it yet. On the other side, the ravine opened into a small box canyon with steep walls covered in moss. The air changed. It got colder. Not gradually, not like the normal drop you feel in shade. It was like walking into a refrigerated room. At the far end, maybe 50 yards away, was a rock face with a dark opening at the base. A cave. The footprints went straight to it. I stopped. Greg stopped. We stood there and stared like two men trying to convince themselves this was normal. Caves exist. They're common in some parts of Appalachia. People shelter in them. People get stuck in them. People die in them. But the way this one sat there, black against damp stone, with the prints leading straight into the mouth, made my mouth go dry. I smelled something faint on the air. Not just mildew. Something organic. Something that told my body, without words, that this was not a place we should enter with fading light and only the two of us. Greg spoke first. His voice was controlled, but there was strain under it. "We need to check it." I nodded because that's what professionalism looks like when your instincts are screaming. You don't dramatize. You don't freeze. You do your job. We approached, flashlights up now, beams cutting into the darkness. The footprints disappeared into the cave like they were swallowed. I stopped at the mouth and called out, loud and clear. "Ethan! Ethan Cole! Search and rescue. If you can hear me, call back." No answer. Greg stepped in. I followed. The cave walls were slick. The ceiling low enough that I had to duck. The smell thickened as we went deeper. My eyes watered. It was damp, cold and wrong in a way that didn't belong to stone and earth. The passage went back about 15 feet and curved right. My light couldn't see beyond that bend. Greg paused at the curve and looked back at me. In his eyes, for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something like hesitation. Then we went around anyway. The passage opened into a larger chamber. My light swept across the floor and I froze so hard my legs locked. Bones. Not one. Not a small scatter like you find when an animal dies in a crawl space. A lot of bones, ribs, vertebrae. Long bones half buried in dirt. Some old, yellowed, brittle. Some newer with remnants of tissue clinging to them like the cave hadn't finished digesting. In the far corner, a pile of clothing. Jackets, shirts, pants, all jumbled like someone had dumped them, and on top, a blue jacket. The same blue. The same fabric. My stomach tightened. Greg whispered something I couldn't make out. It might have been a prayer. It might have been a curse. I didn't move fast. I didn't run. My mind snapped into a kind of cold focus. "We need to leave," I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Now." Greg didn't argue. We backed out, careful not to slip. My light stayed trained on the passage ahead, because some primitive part of me expected something to come around that curve behind us. I expected a sound, a movement, a breath. Nothing did. We made it out of the cave and into the box canyon. The air outside should have felt like relief. It didn't. It felt watched. I radioed Sarah, and my hands were shaking hard enough that the mic bumped against my jacket. "Base, this is Team North 1. We located a cave at the end of a box canyon beyond the boulder gap. Inside the cave are multiple human remains. Bones, along with a large pile of clothing. Possible connection to prior missing persons. Request law enforcement. We are exiting now. The silence that came back on the radio was longer this time. Then Sarah's voice, quieter. Copy. Return to staging. Sheriff has been notified. Do not re-enter. Do not approach. Just get out. We hiked out in near darkness, headlamps on now, beams bouncing with every step. The ravine was harder going uphill. Our breathing came out in harsh bursts. Neither of us spoke. Words felt wrong, like saying too much might anchor something we didn't want anchored. When we reached the trailhead, it was after 8. There were more vehicles. Sheriff's trucks, 2 of them. A couple of deputies standing under the harsh white light of a portable flood lamp. Sarah met us with a face that had shifted from coordinator focus to something tighter, more guarded. The sheriff introduced himself as Carver. Heavyset, middle-aged, with a kind of calm that comes from having seen enough to know panic doesn't help. He listened to our report without interrupting, then asked us to mark the cave location on the map. First thing in the morning, he said, we go in with the coroner. We recover remains. We secure the site. We figure out what we're dealing with. He used words like site and recover and figure out, like this was a standard situation. Maybe to him it was. I went home that night and didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that chamber. The bones. The pile of clothing. The blue jacket like a punctuation mark. And worse than what I saw was what I couldn't stop thinking about. Ethan's pack in that clearing. The neat arrangement. The scratches. The bare footprints. The way it all felt intentional, like someone had staged a path for us to follow. The next morning, Sarah called and asked me to come back. They need a guide, she said. You and Greg are the only ones who can take them straight there. I said yes, because saying no isn't something I've ever been good at. We went in with a larger group. Me, Sarah, 2 deputies, and a forensic tech from the coroner's office. Greg came too, but he didn't talk much. He just walked, eyes forward, jaw tight. Daylight made the woods look normal again, and that was the first lie of the day. Because when we got down into that ravine and past the spot where I'd found the boot, the ground looked disturbed, not by us, not by natural decay, but like something had been there after we left. Leaves shifted, mud smeared, a faint track in the wrong direction. I didn't mention it. I told myself it was us. It was always us. We made the disturbance. We were the variable. But the feeling stayed. In the box canyon, the cave mouth looked smaller than it had in the dark, less dramatic, easier to explain away. The forensic tech didn't look at it like a horror scene. He looked at it like a workplace. He pulled out a camera. He adjusted a light. He said, okay to himself in a voice that carried no emotion, and that was somehow worse. Inside, the smell hit harder in daylight. The chamber looked even more wrong. Bones everywhere. Some clearly human. Others smaller. Animal remains mixed in like the cave didn't discriminate. The pile of clothing sat like a nest. The tech photographed everything. The deputies stood at the entrance, hands near their belts, eyes scanning the shadows like they expected someone to step out. I walked to the clothing pile, and I don't know why. I told myself it was to see if anything identified Ethan. A jacket, a wallet, a phone. I didn't touch. I crouched and looked. I saw the blue jacket, torn the same way as the stripwood found. Under it were other layers, older, rot-stained. A red fleece, jeans, a t-shirt. It had a faded logo on it, and the moment my light hit it, my stomach dropped. A dog. A cartoon dog. I knew that shirt. I'd seen it in a photo 3 years earlier during another missing hiker case. A woman named Amanda Price. Her family had shown us pictures at the staging area, desperate to give us any anchor. What she was wearing, what she carried, what she looked like when she smiled. I remembered the dog because it looked stupidly cheerful, the kind of shirt you'd wear on a casual day hike. Amanda Price had never been found. I called Sarah over and my voice came out too quiet. This shirt, I said. It belonged to Amanda Price. Sarah stared for a second like her brain refused to accept the sentence. Then her face went pale. Are you sure? I'm sure. She called Carver. The sheriff came over, looked at it, and didn't speak for a long moment. Then he pulled out a notebook and wrote something down with slow precision. The forensic tech was asked how many individuals the remains might represent. Hard to say, he said. But based on distribution, at least 6, possibly more. At least 6. In my head, numbers started stacking like stones. We spent the rest of the morning documenting. The deputies searched the rest of the cave. Dead end. No other passages, no hidden exit. Whoever brought people here came in the same way we did. That should have been comforting. It wasn't, because it meant either someone was bold enough to do this repeatedly, carrying bodies into a cave through a ravine without being seen, or the people came on their own. When we were preparing to leave, I noticed the scratches on the cave wall. Same style as the tree bark. Deep. Deliberate. There were groups of them. The tech didn't care about them. He was there for remains. But Sarah did. She counted under her breath. 15. She moved to another cluster, counted again. 15 groups. 15. Not 6, not at least 15. I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. I looked at Greg. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. He looked older in that moment, like something had been confirmed for him that he'd been avoiding. We left. The story hit the news that night. Multiple human remains discovered in Appalachian cave. Investigators suspect foul play. Trail closed temporarily. Media came in like they always do. Cameras. Questions. People who don't understand the terrain pointing at maps on screens and talking about remote wilderness like it's a novelty. Sarah told us not to speak to anyone. Sheriff's Department issued a statement, and that was that. Over the next week, forensic teams worked to identify remains. Some were old, maybe a decade. Others were newer. Amanda Price was confirmed. A few other missing persons cases tied in like threads being pulled tight. But Ethan Cole wasn't in that cave, and that was the first thing that stopped fitting. They searched the area around the cave for days. Dogs, drones, state resources. No sign of Ethan. No body. No clothing beyond that strip and whatever might have been in the pile, which by then was evidence and sealed away. It was like Ethan had been the lure, the fresh case that pulled us into a place we should have found years earlier. And when the investigation started to cool, when the news crews got bored and the trail reopened with new signs and warnings, I tried to tell myself it was done. Then Sarah called me 3 weeks later. Her voice was different. "Marcus," she said, "we've got another one." I didn't ask where, because I already knew. "Same trail system," she said. Woman, mid-20s. Didn't come back from a day hike. Cars still at the trailhead. My stomach dropped like it had a physical weight. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to step into those woods again. I didn't want to see another neat display. But I said yes. Because I always said yes. We staged at dawn. More volunteers this time, nearly 20, plus law enforcement. Sheriff Carver was there, and he looked like a man carrying a secret he couldn't say out loud. They paired me with Deputy Torres. Younger guy, fit, confident in a way that told me he hadn't spent enough nights in these woods to know confidence doesn't matter. We took the same section Greg and I had searched before. We hiked for hours, calling her name, Jennifer Moss. Around midday, Torres stopped and held up a hand. "You hear that?" I listened. At first, nothing. Then faintly, threaded through the trees, a sound like someone calling for help. A woman's voice. It was distant and muffled, but clear enough to punch straight into my chest. Torres' face changed. The hunt energy kicked in. He started moving fast, pushing through underbrush. "Jennifer," he shouted. "Jennifer, keep calling out. We're coming." The voice continued, steady, guiding us. Not frantic. Not the messy sobbing you hear when someone's truly lost and panicking. It was too even. I didn't have time to process that thought before we broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. And the voice stopped. The clearing was empty. Torres spun, breathing hard. "Where is she?" I didn't answer. I was looking at the trees. Scratches. Fresh. Same height. Same style. My mouth went dry. "Torres," I said slowly, and my voice didn't sound like mine. "We need to leave." Right now. He followed my gaze. He saw the marks, and I watched the moment his confidence drained. "What is that?" he asked. I didn't explain. I didn't have an explanation that didn't sound like insanity. I radioed Sarah. I told her what we'd heard and what we'd found. Her response came immediate. "Return to staging. Now." We backed out of the clearing like it was a live wire. I kept my light on the tree line. Torres kept glancing behind us like he expected the voice to start again. When we got back, it was chaos. Another team had found something. A backpack, a jacket, and a pair of boots. Jennifer's, arranged neatly in a clearing, and nearby, bare footprints leading into the woods. Exactly like Ethan. Sheriff Carver ordered everyone to pull back. He didn't call it by name, but his face said it. He thought someone was luring people, a person, a predator, a serial offender who understood SAR protocols and used them against us. State police got involved. Then federal. They interviewed all of us. They mapped everything. They sealed the cave. They treated it like a crime scene. They never found Jennifer Moss. They never found Ethan Cole. They found more scratches, more clearings, more neat displays. And then quietly, without any announcement, the official tone shifted. Not on paper, not in press conferences, in the way calls were handled, in the way the sheriff's department started using certain phrases on radio, in the way Sarah stopped writing full details in group texts and started calling individuals instead, and in the way Greg stopped showing up to training. I called Greg once. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. He didn't return it. A month later, Sarah told me Greg had quit. No drama, just gone. Turned in his team radio. Said he was done. People leave SAR for lots of reasons. Burnout, family, injury, work. But when someone like Greg leaves, you pay attention. Because men like Greg don't quit easily. I stopped sleeping well. I'd wake up with that woman's voice in my head, calling for help, and I'd lie there in the dark, listening to my own house like it was a forest. I tried to tell myself I was done too, that I'd step back, take a break. Then my phone buzzed 2 days ago. Unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped. A voicemail came in. No words, just static and something underneath it. Faint, rhythmic, wet. Breathing. I deleted it. Told myself it was nothing. A bad connection. A prank. But here's why I'm recording this now. Because last night on my way home from a job site, I took a shortcut I've taken 100 times. A back road that cuts along a line of trees before it opens into farmland. And on one of those trees, at about 5 feet off the ground, tied tight like a deliberate marker, was a strip of bright blue nylon. The same blue. Not faded. Not old. New. New. And just beyond it, deeper in the tree line where the headlights didn't fully reach, I saw another strip. And another. A line leading away from the road, off into woods that don't have trails. Woods that don't belong to any park system. Woods no hiker would choose. I didn't stop the truck. I didn't slow down. But my hands were shaking on the wheel. Because in 7 years of search and rescue, I've learned to trust patterns more than explanations. And the pattern is moving. It's not staying in one ravine, one cave, one trail system. It's learning routes. It's placing things where people like me will notice. And I know what you're thinking. If you're still listening, if you haven't clicked away, you're thinking this is just a person, a serial killer, a drifter who found a way to hide evidence and manipulate search teams. That's what law enforcement believed too, at least at first. I wanted to believe it. I still want to believe it, because a person fits into a framework. A person can be caught. A person can be shot. A person makes mistakes. But there are details they didn't put in the reports. Details they told us not to talk about. Details that started showing up only after the FBI took over and the trailhead briefings stopped being public. I'm going to tell you those details now the way I remember them, the way they happened, without dressing them up. Because if the pattern has moved to my roads, then it's not just a mountain problem anymore. And I need someone else to know what the rules are, even if no one writes them down. The first unwritten rule in SAR is that you never follow a voice blindly. We teach it in training, but we don't talk about why. We talk about echoes. We talk about wind. We talk about how sound carries weird in valleys. We don't talk about what happens when the voice is too steady. We don't talk about clearings with scratches. We don't talk about how some teams learned quietly to mark certain areas on maps in pencil and never go in alone. We call them hazards. We call them unstable terrain. We don't call them what they feel like. And the second unwritten rule is this: if you find someone's belongings arranged neatly, like a display, you do not touch them until someone senior has eyes on the scene. Because once you move them, you lose what the scene is telling you. And the scene is always telling you something. The problem is, the longer you do this, the more you start to recognize the language. And once you recognize it, you start to realize it's not written for the missing hiker. It's written for you. After Jennifer disappeared, after the cave was sealed, after the FBI came in, they asked us to come in for debriefings. Not all at once. In small groups, controlled. Like they were trying to keep us from comparing notes. The first debrief I attended was in a small conference room at the sheriff's office. Fluorescent lights, cheap coffee, a table covered in printed satellite maps. A man in a suit introduced himself as Special Agent Lane. He didn't give a first name. He didn't smile. He asked me to walk him through everything. Ethan, the boot, the clearing, the scratches, the footprints, the cave. Jennifer, the voice, the empty clearing. The marks again. I told him facts. I stayed calm. I kept my hands on the table so he could see they weren't shaking. When I finished, he nodded like he was filing it away. Then he asked, "Were there any other anomalies?" That word stuck out. Anomalies. Not unusual details. Not oddities. Anomalies. I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Anything that didn't fit normal environmental conditions." I thought about the silence, the cold air at the box canyon, the smell, the way the woman's voice carried. I started to answer. Sarah cut in from the corner of the room. She'd been sitting quietly, hands clasped. She said, "We've covered the relevant information." Agent Lane's eyes flicked to her, then back to me. "Have you experienced equipment interference?" he asked. "Like what?" "GPS malfunction, radio dead zones, compass anomalies." My mouth went dry again, because that was the third thing that didn't fit. Something we hadn't mentioned publicly, something we'd chalked up to terrain until it happened in ways terrain didn't explain. I looked at Sarah. She didn't move, but I understood the message. Not here, not like this. So I said no. Agent Lane wrote something down anyway. When the meeting ended, Sarah pulled me aside in the hallway. Her voice was low. "Don't volunteer extras," she said. "Answer what they ask, nothing more." "Why?" I asked. She stared at me like she was measuring whether I could handle the truth. "Because once it's on paper," she said, "it becomes something they have to explain. And they don't want to explain it." I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask what she knew, but she turned away and started walking, and I realized something else. Sarah was scared. Not scared like someone afraid of the woods. Scared like someone afraid of being overheard. That was when I started keeping my own log again. Not the official SAR logs. Those are clean. Times, coordinates, actions. They get submitted. They get reviewed. They get stored. I mean a personal log. A notebook I kept in a drawer in my kitchen. Dates, details, things that didn't fit. Things you'd be embarrassed to say out loud but couldn't shake. Silence, cold pockets of air. Neat displays. Scratches, bare footprints. Voices, too steady. Equipment that worked perfectly everywhere else, and failed in one specific radius like something was dampening it. I did it because that's how my mind stays sane. It builds frameworks. It tracks patterns. It makes order. And if you think this is turning into a story about me obsessing, you're right. Because that's part of what happened. The pattern doesn't just take hikers. It takes the people who go looking. Not always physically. Sometimes it just takes pieces of you. A week after the first FBI debrief, I got a call from Sarah late at night. It was after 10. Her voice was tight. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to meet me. Now." I asked where. She gave me an address I recognized, an old Forest Service maintenance lot a couple miles from the main highway, closed at night. No lights. It was a strange place to meet unless you didn't want to be seen. I almost said no. I didn't. I drove. When I pulled in, Sarah was already there, sitting in her SUV with the engine off, headlights out. She had a small lantern on the dashboard, just enough light to make her face visible. I parked beside her and got out. The night air was cold. The lot smelled like oil and wet gravel. She rolled her window down and said, "Get in." I hesitated, then opened the passenger door and climbed in. She didn't waste time. "They're not telling us everything," she said. "I know," I replied. She stared at the steering wheel like it was safer than looking at me. "Carver got a call," she said. "From state, not FBI, state. They told him to stop using volunteers on any callets within the Hawkville system unless law enforcement is present. They're labeling it a high-risk corridor." "That's good," I said. "Maybe they've got leads." Sarah shook her head slowly. "They don't have leads," she said. "They have a classification." "What does that mean?" She took a breath. "It means," she said, "they've seen this before somewhere else." I felt my stomach tighten. "Where?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. She reached into her center console and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Not an official document. A photocopy. Old. She handed it to me. It was a map segment, not of Hawkville Ridge. Different topography. Different labeling. And on it, in pencil, were circles. A series of circles marked across a region like someone had been tracking a spread. In the corner was a date, and a handwritten note in block letters. "Do not search after dusk. Do not follow voices." I looked up at Sarah. "Where did you get this?" She swallowed. "Carver showed me," she said. "Off the record. He said it was from a retired ranger he knows in Tennessee. Said the ranger told him to stop treating this like a normal case." My mouth was dry. I stared at the map again. The circles weren't random. They formed a line, a progression, like something moving. Sarah's voice dropped. "And Marcus," she said, "there's something else." "What?" She hesitated, then said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "Greg called me." My chest tightened. "When?" "2 nights ago." "What did he say?" Sarah stared straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel. "He said," she told me, "that he found something in his yard." I felt a chill. "Like what?" She took a breath. "A hiking boot," she said. "Brown. Still laced. Sitting on his back porch like someone placed it there." I stared at her. My brain tried to reject it. Greg didn't live near the trails. Greg didn't have hikers walking through his yard. Sarah's voice was flat now. "He said he didn't call the sheriff," she added. "He didn't call FBI. He didn't call anyone. He called me." "Why?" "Because he said," she replied, "he recognized the scratches on the porch railing." I felt my throat tighten. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Sarah's eyes finally met mine. "I told him to leave," she said. "I told him to go somewhere with people. Somewhere with cameras. Somewhere he won't be alone." "And?" Sarah shook her head once. "He didn't," she said. I sat there in the dark maintenance lot with that photocopied map on my lap, and the breath left my lungs in a slow leak, because I'd seen the scratches. Not just on trees. Not just in a cave. On my road. On that blue nylon. And now in Greg's yard. Which meant the pattern wasn't following hikers anymore. It was following those of us who learned to read it. Sarah's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to do something." "What?" "I need you to promise me," she said, "that if you see something, anything, outside the search zones, you call me before you call anyone else." "That's insane," I said. "Why would I not call the sheriff?" "Because the sheriff is being told what to do," she replied, "and we're being managed." I wanted to argue. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she was spiraling, that she was paranoid. That stress does this, but I couldn't. Because I'd seen the strip of blue nylon on the road. I'd heard the voice in the clearing. I'd stood in that cave with bones under my boots. And I'd felt, in a way I couldn't explain, that something had wanted us there. I looked at her lantern-lit face and asked, "What do you think it is?" Sarah swallowed. "I don't know," she said. "I just know it's not one man with a knife." Then she said the thing that changed how I slept from that night forward. "They're calling it a collection," she whispered. "Not officially, not on paper. But that's what I heard one of the agents say when they thought I wasn't listening." "A collection of what?" Sarah's eyes looked hollow. "People," she said. "Their things, their lives, arranged." I stared at the map again. The circles, the line, the spread. And I thought about that cave wall with 15 groups of marks. Tally marks, counting. And I realized something that felt like a door closing in my head. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't opportunistic. This was inventory. And if it was inventory, then the missing hikers weren't just victims. They were entries. And entries mean someone is keeping track. I handed the photocopy back to Sarah and got out of the SUV. Cold air hit my face. I stood in the dark lot and listened. In the distance, somewhere past the tree line, an owl called. The sound should have been normal, comforting even, but all I could think was that the woods were still there, waiting, quiet in that way that feels like a held breath. Sarah rolled her window up. The lantern light dimmed behind the glass. Before she drove off, she leaned out and said, "Lock your doors, Marcus." I nodded. I didn't tell her I already had. I didn't tell her that I'd started checking my windows twice before bed. I didn't tell her about the voicemail with breathing. I didn't tell her that part of me wanted to go back to Hawkville. Not because I wanted answers, but because something in my mind kept returning to the cave like a tongue finding a sore tooth. Because that's another thing nobody writes down in SAR. There are places in these mountains that don't just scare you. They call you. And once you've heard the call, even faintly, even once, it stays in you like a splinter. That was the start of the slow build. That was when my normal routines started failing. Because my work in construction is routine. My life is simple. Wake up, job site, eat, sleep. SAR calls break the pattern, but they're contained. They happen, you respond. You debrief, you recover. This didn't contain. This leaked. It started showing up in daylight on roads that weren't part of any trail system. It started showing up in my head when I was standing on a roof with a nail gun, staring at a line of trees in the distance, and wondering what was tied to them at 5 feet off the ground. And then, on a Monday morning in November, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't Sarah. It was the county dispatch number. I stared at it until it stopped. Because I'd started doing something I never used to do. I'd started letting calls go to voicemail. That alone should tell you what this did to me. The voicemail was short. A woman's voice, professional. "Marcus, this is dispatch. We have a request for SAR assistance. Missing juvenile. Last seen near." I deleted it. Not because I didn't care. "The kid's father is law enforcement," she said. "And the last known location is not Hawkville." My throat tightened. "Where?" 10 miles west, she replied. "Old timberland. Private property. Not on any maps." I felt my hand start to shake, because 10 miles west was exactly where I'd seen the blue nylon on that back road. Sarah's voice went lower. "And Marcus," she said, "they found something at the edge of the property." I swallowed. "What?" She hesitated like she hated the word. "A sign," she said. I didn't ask what it said. I already knew. But I asked anyway, because sometimes you need to hear it out loud to understand it's real. Sarah's voice came through the phone. Flat, controlled, like she was reading from a report she didn't want to exist. It says, "She told me, no further." And as she spoke, my kitchen window, behind the sink, looking out into my yard, made a small, soft tapping sound, like something had touched the glass with a fingernail. I turned my head slowly. Nothing was there, just darkness and the vague outline of my fence. I stood there with the phone to my ear, listening to Sarah breathe on the line, and I realized a third unwritten rule. If the pattern expands, it doesn't do it randomly. It expands along people, along roads, along the ones who answer calls. And I had just answered. I told Sarah I'd be there in 20. I grabbed my pack, and before I left my house, I did something I'd never done before a search. I walked to my front door, looked at the peephole, and checked the porch like I expected to see an arranged display sitting there waiting for me. There was nothing, but on the wooden rail, where my hand rested when I leaned in, I felt a shallow groove. A scratch. Fresh enough that the wood edges were still sharp, at about 5 feet off the ground. I pulled my hand back like I touched a hot stove. Then I left anyway, because in this line of work, you learn pretty quick that people are stupid, but you also learn something harder. Sometimes the people who think they're not stupid are the easiest ones to lead. And I had a bad feeling that whatever was writing these rules knew exactly what kind of person I was. The kind who always says yes. I didn't tell Sarah about the scratch on my porch rail. Not because I wanted to keep secrets from her, but because the moment you say something like that out loud, it stops being a private unease and becomes an official variable, something other people will try to explain, categorize, and ultimately dismiss. And I couldn't afford dismissal. I drove west with my gear rattling in the passenger seat, headlights cutting through a thin mist that hugged the low ground like smoke. The road narrowed fast, turning from county asphalt to patchy gravel, then to dirt packed hard by trucks and logging equipment. The kind of access road you don't find unless you're looking for it, and the kind that doesn't show up on most consumer GPS maps. My phone signal dropped to 1 bar, then none. That should have been normal. We have dead zones all over the ridge system, but this felt different because it happened in a clean cutoff, like someone flipped a switch. One moment I had a route line and an estimated arrival time. The next moment my screen was a blank map with a spinning icon that never resolved. I switched to offline topo maps. Same thing. Loading, then failing. My phone wasn't just out of service. It was acting like it couldn't locate itself. I set it down. You can't let tech failure rattle you in this work. You fall back on fundamentals. Landmarks, paper maps, compass, time-distance estimates. I had those. Still, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. When I reached the staging area, it wasn't a trailhead. It was a wide clearing carved into timberland, bordered by stacked logs and a row of orange equipment cones. Sheriff's vehicles were parked in a loose semicircle, floodlights washing the scene in hard white glare. There was a canvas pop-up tent, a folding table covered in paperwork, and a cluster of people talking in short, clipped sentences. Sarah's SUV was there. I pulled in beside it and got out. The air smelled like sap and diesel. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a generator hummed steadily. Under the floodlights, everyone looked pale and flat, like a scene in a documentary. Sarah met me halfway. Her face was tight, but her eyes were clear. "Thanks for coming," she said. "What do we have?" I asked. She handed me a printed 1-page incident brief. Thin, rushed, the kind you get when law enforcement is trying to move fast. Missing juvenile, male, 12, name, Caleb Harlan, last seen, 17:20 yesterday. Location, private timber property, Harlan tract, approx. 400 acres, reported, 18.5 by father. Weather, clear evening, low 40s overnight. Resources, canine pending, drone team en route, state police present. I skimmed it once, then looked up. "Father is a deputy?" Sarah nodded. "Deputy Harlan. He works county. Different shift from Taurus. He called it in himself." I glanced toward the deputies. One man stood apart from the group near a sheriff's unit, hands on hips, staring into the tree line like he could force it to give something back. He looked exhausted in that specific way parents look when they've been holding panic in their teeth for hours. "That's him?" I asked. Sarah said, "Yeah." I didn't approach. "Not yet." I didn't approach. "Not yet." "What's with the sign?" I said. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Carver wants you to see it before we brief." She led me past the tent, around the edge of the clearing, toward a narrow cut line that disappeared into trees. At the boundary, someone had tied fluorescent tape to branches and hammered a few reflective markers into the ground. It looked like the start of a search corridor. And there it was, a piece of plywood nailed to a standing pine at chest height. The wood was rough, like it had been ripped off an old crate. The letters were painted in thick black strokes, uneven and wet-looking even though the paint had dried. No further. Just that. No. Trespassing. No danger. No private property. No further. I stood there and stared at it until Sarah's voice pulled me back. "It wasn't there yesterday," she said quietly. "Harlan swears it. Who found it?" I asked. "A deputy doing an initial sweep," she replied. "About 2 hours after dark." I leaned closer, not touching it, just reading the strokes. The paint had bled into the grain in a way that suggested it wasn't done with a marker. This was brushed, fast, heavy pressure. Any footprints? I asked. Sarah shook her head. Leaf cover. They didn't see anything obvious. I looked beyond the sign. Past the reflective markers, the cut line was a straight corridor through timber, trees planted in rows, ground carpeted in needles and leaves, visibility better than the ravines at Hawkville. If you were going to search at night, this terrain was safer than most. So why post a sign that tells you to stop? Sarah watched me and said, Carver wants to keep this controlled. He's spooked. Carver's always spooked, I said. She didn't smile. He's not spooked like a sheriff who found a murder cave, she said. He's spooked like a man who's heard the same story from 2 different places. I felt my stomach tighten. Okay, I said. Brief me. We walked back to the staging table. Sheriff Carver stood over a map with 2 state troopers and Deputy Harlan. When he saw me, he gave a short nod. Marcus, he said. Glad you're here. Deputy Harlan looked at me like I was a tool he wanted to use immediately. His eyes were red. He hadn't slept. His uniform was wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for 30 hours. That's my boy, he said without introduction, as if saying his role was enough. He knows this land. He's been out here with me 100 times. Carver held up a hand gently. We're going to do this right, he said. He pointed at the map. It was a printed aerial photo with property lines drawn in red. Someone had marked a small rectangle near the eastern boundary. Last known point, Carver said. Caleb was playing near the old logging pad here. Harlan stepped away for a phone call. 10 minutes. When he came back, kid was gone. Deputy Harlan's voice cracked. 8 minutes, he said. It was 8 minutes. Carver didn't argue the number. He continued. We did an initial sweep last night. No response to calls. No sign of injury. No obvious tracks. We held off on a full search until daylight for safety and coverage. He glanced toward me. Then we found that sign. I asked, any reason someone would be out here? Deputy Harlan said, no. Gates are locked. It's my family's tract. People don't wander in. Carver's eyes flicked to him, then back to the table. We're treating this as both missing child and potential criminal interference, he said. State is here. Drone team will do an overflight. 9 is 20 minutes out. Sarah looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to ask the question that mattered, so I asked it. Any gear left behind? I said. Backpack, jacket, boots? Deputy Harlan's jaw tightened. Caleb had a small day pack, he said. Blue. Little hydration pouch? He always carries it because he thinks he's a real hiker. A slow chill moved through me. What kind of blue? I asked, and I hated how my voice sounded when I asked it. Harlan looked confused. Just blue, he said. Why? He said. Why? I nodded once, like I was filing a fact. Carver assigned teams. The terrain was divided into grids with cut lines and boundary markers. It was, on paper, an easier search than Hawkville. Cleaner lines. Fewer ravines. Better visibility. But then Carver added something unusual. No one goes past the sign alone, he said. 2 minimum. Radios on. Check-ins every 15. If you hear anything that sounds like a call, any call, you stop and you radio it in. You do not follow sound without confirmation. One of the troopers frowned. That's standard lost person procedure, he said. Carver didn't look at him. It is today, he replied. He looked at me like he wanted me to understand the subtext without him saying it out loud. I did. Sarah paired me with a trooper named Willoughby. Mid-30s, competent, skeptical. The kind of guy who believed the world stayed inside the categories he'd been trained on. I didn't blame him. I envied it. We stepped off around 9:40, following the cut line straight past the no further sign and into planted timber. The ground was soft with needles. The air was cold enough to sting. Every sound carried. We moved in a slow sweep, scanning for disturbance. Small prints, broken branches, a dropped wrapper, a scrape on bark. Anything. 10 minutes in, Willoughby said, "This is the weirdest warning sign I've seen." I didn't answer. We passed a shallow drainage ditch and found the first real sign. A small plastic straw from a juice box, bright red, lying on top of leaves like it had been placed. Not half buried. Not stepped on. Clean. Willoughby crouched and picked it up with gloved fingers. "Kids," he muttered. I looked around and saw another item 5 yards ahead. A torn piece of blue mesh. My stomach tightened so hard it was almost painful. I raised a hand and stopped him. "Don't touch that," I said. He looked at me. "Why?" "Because we document first," I replied, keeping my voice professional. "Photos, position, orientation." He gave a short nod, slightly annoyed but compliant. He took out his phone and snapped pictures. I radioed Sarah with coordinates. Then we followed the line. What we found over the next 20 minutes didn't look like a kid dropping things accidentally. It looked like breadcrumbs. A candy wrapper placed flat. A small rubber wristband. A single child's glove, laid palm up. And then, ahead of us, the timber rows opened into a small clearing. An old logging pad packed dirt with weeds pushing through. Then a place a kid would treat like a playground. At the center of the pad was a small blue backpack, upright, leaning against a stump, like it had been arranged for a photo. Willoughby stopped dead. "Okay," he said quietly. "That's not normal." I didn't move fast. I didn't rush to it like hope was going to evaporate. I approached slowly, scanning the perimeter first, and that's when I saw them. Scratches. Not on every tree, but on 4 trees around the pad. Evenly spaced. Fresh gouges in bark at about 5 feet off the ground, as if someone had stood there and dragged something hard across the surface with deliberate pressure. I stared at them and felt a familiar, sick recognition. Willoughby saw them too. His expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to caution. "What is that?" he asked. I said, "I don't know." But I did know, in the only way that matters in this job. I knew it was the same language. I radioed Sarah. We located the child's pack, arranged upright on the logging pad. Multiple fresh bark gouges on perimeter trees, same height, deliberate. "Request additional units and 9 to our position." Sarah's response came back immediate. "Too quick. Copy. Hold position. Do not disturb the pack. Teams converging." We waited. The minutes stretched. And in those minutes, something happened that I still don't have a clean explanation for. From the tree line beyond the logging pad, we heard a child's voice. Soft at first, almost like it was behind a wall. "Dad?" Willoughby's head snapped toward the sound. "Caleb!" he shouted, and his voice cracked with sudden adrenaline. "Caleb, stay where you are!" I raised a hand hard and grabbed his sleeve. "Stop," I said sharply. He looked at me like I was insane. "That's him. It's a voice," I said. "We don't move until we confirm. We radio. We confirm." The voice came again, clearer now. "Dad, I'm here." It wasn't screaming. It wasn't crying. It was steady, too steady. A perfect lure. Willoughby shook my hand off. He took 1 step forward. I pulled him back harder. "No," I said, and I put enough force in it that he finally read the urgency. He stared at me. "You're telling me not to go to a missing kid calling for his dad?" "I'm telling you we don't follow sound blind," I said, and my voice stayed low and controlled. "We get eyes. We get backup. We do not split." The voice shifted slightly, like it moved along the tree line. "Dad, please." Willoughby's face went pale. He swallowed. His whole body wanted to go. Mine did too. "That's the point." I keyed the radio and said, "Base, we have auditory contact." Child voice calling Dad from the north tree line perimeter. "We are holding position. Request immediate convergence." Sarah came back clipped. "Copy. Hold." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just Dad. It said my name. Marcus. I froze so hard I felt it in my spine. Willoughby looked at me slowly. "Did you?" he started. I didn't answer, because my name isn't on any public report. My name wasn't shouted last night in this timberland, and yet it came from the trees like it belonged there. "Marcus," the voice said again. "Help me." Willoughby's eyes were wide now. "What the hell?" I raised my flashlight and swept the tree line, searching for movement. My beam caught nothing but trunks, needles, and shadow. The voice continued. patient, calm, as if it had infinite time. And then, without warning, it stopped. Just cut off. No fading. No retreat. Silence. In that silence, the generator hum from the staging area felt far away. The world narrowed to the logging pad, the pack, the scratches, and the tree line that looked completely normal. Willoughby whispered, "That was a kid." I looked at him and said, "I don't know what that was." Then the 9 team arrived, 2 handlers, 1 dog. Behind them came Deputy Harlan, Sheriff Carver, and Sarah. Harlan didn't wait for briefing. He ran straight toward the tree line where the voice had come from, shouting his son's name until his voice broke. Carver grabbed him and held him back hard, speaking low, urgent. Sarah came to me. Her eyes flicked to my face like she already knew. "You heard it," she said. I nodded once. "And it said your name," she said, not asking. I didn't answer because the admission felt like stepping onto thin ice. Sarah turned to the dog handler. "Start on the pack," she said, then worked the tree line. The handler brought the dog to the backpack. The dog sniffed, tail stiff, then moved toward the tree line. It took 3 steps, then it stopped. Its ears flattened. It backed up fast, whining, dragging the handler backward as if the ground ahead had turned hot. The handler swore under his breath. "He won't go," he said. Carver's face tightened. "Try again." The handler tried again, firmer. The dog lunged forward, then immediately recoiled, whining louder, turning its head away from the trees. It planted its paws and refused to move. The handler looked up, pale. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "He's spooked." Carver stared into the tree line like he wanted to burn it down with his eyes. Sarah leaned toward me and whispered, "This is what they didn't want in reports." I watched Deputy Harlan's face crumble as he realized the dog wouldn't track, and in that moment, the timberland didn't feel like a search zone anymore. It felt like a boundary, a place where something was telling us, in the simplest words possible, no further. And the worst part was this: it wasn't a warning for Caleb. It was a warning for us. Carver didn't say the word, "Stand down," but that's what happened. Not officially. Not in a way that would show up in a report. But you could see it in how the perimeter tightened instead of expanded, in how radios went quiet except for command traffic, in how the state troopers started positioning themselves at access points instead of pushing deeper. The dog wouldn't go forward. They tried a second 9. Same reaction, different handler, same result. 3 steps into the tree line, then refusal. Ears back, tail low, body angled away like the ground itself was hostile. That's when the first excuse appeared. "Environmental contamination," one of the troopers said. "Residual chemicals from old logging operations could confuse scent." It was said confidently, the way people say things when they need the explanation more than the truth. Nobody argued out loud. Deputy Harlan was shaking now. Not with rage, not with hysteria, but with the kind of contained panic that looks almost calm if you don't know what you're seeing. He kept staring at the trees like his son might step out any second if he just watched hard enough. Carver took him aside. "I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough. Not safe. Protocol. We'll keep looking." Harlan nodded like he understood, but his eyes never left the tree line. Sarah pulled me a few steps away. "You need to listen carefully," she said. "They're about to change how this is handled." I asked, "How?" "They're going to redefine the search area," she replied. "Shrink it. Shrink it. Call anything past that sign unsearchable terrain." "That's bullshit," I said. "This land isn't dangerous terrain. It's flat timber." Sarah didn't disagree. She said, "Danger isn't the word they're using." She hesitated. Anomalous. There it was again. Not terrain. Not suspect. Anomalous. I looked back at the logging pad. The backpack sat there, upright, untouched, like it was waiting for us to decide something. Carver called everyone together. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. "Listen up," he said. "We're going to pause forward movement past the eastern tree line until we reassess. Drone team will do a high pass. State will handle perimeter. SAR will maintain grid inside current boundary." Deputy Harlan took a step forward. "You're stopping?" he said, and his voice cracked hard. "My kid is out there." Carver met his eyes. "We're not stopping," he said. "We're adjusting." Harlan laughed once, sharp and broken. "Adjusting what?" Carver didn't answer directly. "We need to make sure we don't lose anyone else," he said. That sentence landed wrong. "Lose anyone else?" Harlan went still. "Anyone else?" he repeated. Nobody answered him. The drone went up 10 minutes later. You could hear it buzzing overhead like a mechanical insect, rising above the trees until it was just a speck against the pale sky. One of the troopers watched a tablet screen, fingers moving with practiced ease. They flew grid patterns over the tree line, over the timber rows, over the old logging roads. Nothing. No heat signature. No movement. No body. The drone crossed the boundary beyond the "no further" sign and continued west. Then the screen flickered, just for a second. The trooper frowned and tapped it. "Signal interference," he muttered. "Probably terrain shadow." Except the terrain, there was flat. The feed stabilized, but the western edge of the image looked wrong. Not distorted. Not static. Just slightly darker, like the exposure hadn't corrected properly. The trooper adjusted settings. The darkness remained. He zoomed in. The image sharpened, and then froze. The drone lost connection entirely a moment later and initiated auto-return. When it came back down, its casing was cold to the touch, like it had been flying at altitude instead of a few hundred feet. They logged it as a malfunction. They always do. By early afternoon, the narrative had shifted. This was no longer an active rescue. It was an investigation. They brought in crime scene tape and wrapped it around the logging pad, around the pack, around the trees with the scratches. The backpack became evidence instead of hope. Deputy Harlan sat on the tailgate of his cruiser with his head in his hands. I stood there and felt something break quietly inside me, because I'd seen this pivot before. Not with a kid, never with a kid, but with adults, with hikers, with cases that crossed some invisible line where urgency gave way to containment. Sarah found me again. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, like the job had finally reached a layer she couldn't compartmentalize. "They're going to suspend volunteer SAR involvement after today," she said. "At least in this corridor." "But for how long?" She shook her head. "Undefined. That's bureaucratic language for forever." "What about the voice?" I asked. "What about the fact it said my name?" Sarah looked around before answering. "That part," she said quietly, "is being omitted. From reports, from everything," she replied. I let out a slow breath. "You know that doesn't make it go away." "I know," she said, "but it keeps it from spreading." She didn't say panic. She didn't have to. We were dismissed an hour later. No press, no briefing. Just quiet instructions and a tightened perimeter. As I walked back to my truck, I passed the sign again. No further. Up close, I noticed something I hadn't before. Under the black paint, faint but visible if you looked at the angle right, were older marks. Not letters. Scratches. Deep ones, sanded down and painted over like someone had erased a previous message. I stared at it too long. A trooper noticed and said, "You okay?" I nodded and walked away. That night I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly for an hour, then parked in a grocery store lot and sat there with the engine off, listening to the cooling ticks of the hood. Because I knew something then that I hadn't wanted to accept before. This wasn't escalating randomly. It was progressing. The hikers, the cave, the voices, the arranged packs, now a child. And every step forward coincided with people like me being present. Responders. Searchers, the ones trained to notice patterns. I went home eventually, after midnight. The house was dark and quiet. I checked the porch before unlocking the door. Nothing new. Inside, I didn't turn on lights right away. I stood in the dark and listened. You learn to do that in SAR. You pause. You let the environment speak before you move through it. The house sounded normal. Refrigerator hum, pipes ticking. Nothing else. I slept badly. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with the certainty that someone had said my name, not in a dream. Out loud, I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. Silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere outside, not close enough to localize, not far enough to ignore, I heard it again. Marcus. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was patient, like it knew I'd wake up eventually. I didn't answer. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths the way we're taught to do when adrenaline spikes. The voice didn't repeat itself. But I didn't sleep again. The next morning, Sarah texted me a single sentence. "They're calling it a containment zone now." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Containment. Not search, not rescue. Containment. That's when I understood the fourth unwritten rule. When authorities stop using the word missing, it's not because they found the person. It's because they've accepted something else has them. And once that shift happens, the job isn't to bring anyone back. It's to keep whatever it is from spreading. That afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number with a Tennessee area code. I almost didn't answer. I did anyway. The man on the line didn't introduce himself by name. He said, "You were on the Hawkville recoveries." Not a question. "Yes," I said cautiously. "There was a cave," he continued. "Multiple remains. Arranged items." My grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been where you are now," he replied, "and someone who wishes he hadn't ignored the early signs." "I didn't speak," he said. "They didn't tell you about the first sight, did they?" My stomach dropped. "What first sight?" He exhaled slowly, like he was bracing himself. "West Tennessee," he said. 2011. Timberland. Private tract. Missing hiker at first. Then another. Then a child. My blood went cold. "Same pattern?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Same displays. Same voices. Same scratches." I swallowed. "What happened?" There was a pause long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, "They closed it." "Closed what?" "The area," he replied. "Declared it unsafe. Bought out landowners quietly. Rewrote maps. Told locals it was sinkholes and unstable ground." "And the people?" I asked. "The missing?" he said. "They stayed missing." I leaned against the kitchen counter because my legs suddenly didn't feel reliable. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Because you answered the phone," he said. "And because it's moved farther east than it ever did before." He hesitated, then added, "And because it started using names sooner." My mouth went dry. "It used names there too?" "Yes," he said. "But not right away. It learned them." "Learned how?" "By listening," he replied. I thought of the voice calling from the tree line, the way it shifted, the way it said my name without hesitation. "Listen to me," the man said. "If you want to survive this, you need to stop responding." "Stop responding to what?" "To everything," he said. "Calls, curiosity, the urge to go back." "That's not how this works," I said. "People go missing. We look for them." "I know," he replied. "That's why it works." He went quiet for a second, then said, "The ones who lasted longest were the ones who broke routine." My chest tightened. "Different routes," he continued. "Different schedules. No patterns. No predictability." That hit too close to something I'd written in my private log weeks earlier. "What happens if you don't?" I asked. The man's voice dropped. "Then you become familiar," he said. "And familiarity is inventory." The line went dead. I stood there with the phone to my ear long after the call ended, because I knew then that this wasn't just case one anymore. Case one was the door. What came after was something else entirely. And the worst part was this. Part of me still wanted to go back, not to rescue anyone, but to see if the rules held. Because once you start seeing the pattern, it does something to you. It makes you want to test it, and that urge, the need to confirm, is exactly how it keeps growing. The first responder disappearance didn't make the news. Not the way the hikers did. Not the way a missing child would have if the perimeter hadn't gone up so fast and so quietly. It happened 3 days after the containment designation. His name was Eli Parker, 34, volunteer SAR, former EMT. Married, no kids. The kind of guy who always showed up early and stayed late, not because anyone asked him to, but because he didn't know how not to. He wasn't assigned to Hawkville. That's important. He lived 2 counties over and had only been involved peripherally. Logistics, radio relay, a few night perimeter shifts before the state took over. No direct contact with the site past the first day. Which meant, on paper, he was safe. Eli left for work at 6:10 a.m., like he always did. His wife watched him pull out of the driveway. She later told deputies he waved, same as every morning. He never arrived. His truck was found that evening parked on the shoulder of a rural access road about 12 miles from his usual route. Doors unlocked. Keys in the cup holder, phone on the passenger seat, face down. No sign of struggle. The official explanation was voluntary disappearance, stress, burnout, overexposure to traumatic material. That was the language used. But I saw the internal memo Sarah wasn't supposed to show me. It included one line that made my stomach drop. Witness reports audio anomaly prior to disappearance. Plural. Witnesses. 2 people had heard something near Eli's truck that morning. A road crew working a quarter-mile down had reported someone calling out, but when they looked up, the road was empty. One of them described the voice as wrong somehow. Not loud, not aggressive, just insistent. They assumed it was someone on a phone call they couldn't see. They didn't investigate. No one does. When they searched the area around the truck, they found footprints leading into the trees. Barefoot. That detail never left the internal report. It never reached Eli's wife. I knew this because she called me. I didn't know how she got my number. I didn't ask, she said. They told me you worked with him. I said yes. She asked, did he say anything to you before he disappeared? I told her the truth. No. That wasn't the whole truth. Eli had called me the night before. I'd missed it. He left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it until after his truck was found. In the message, his voice was tight, controlled, trying not to sound like someone asking for reassurance. Hey man, he said. I know this sounds stupid, but have you heard it outside the zone? He paused, like he was choosing words carefully. I keep thinking I hear someone calling my name when I'm driving, just for a second, like it's coming from the trees. Another pause. I know it's stress, he said quickly. I just wanted to check if I was the only one. The message ended there. I sat in my truck in my driveway listening to it on repeat until the sun went down. Because that's when the 5th unwritten rule became clear. It doesn't need the forest once it has you. The perimeter, the signs, the trails. Those are training wheels. Once it learns your voice, once it understands how you move through the world, it doesn't need trees anymore. It uses absence. That night I broke routine for the first time. I didn't sleep in my bedroom. I didn't park in my driveway. I drove until I was exhausted and slept in a motel off the interstate with the curtains open and the TV on low volume. In the morning I checked out under a fake name. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself a lot of things. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eli's truck on the side of that road, perfectly intact, like he'd stepped out voluntarily, like he'd been called somewhere just out of frame. The state closed Hawkville entirely a week later. They erected fencing, posted hazard notices, removed the sign that said no further, and replaced it with a standardized placard citing unstable subsurface conditions. Sinkholes. That's the word they used publicly. Privately, they used a different phrase. Active acquisition zone. Sarah showed me that phrase once, then told me never to ask about it again. She stopped returning my calls not long after. Not because she didn't care, because she did. That's how you know when someone understands the stakes. The last time I saw the Hawkville area was from a distance, driving a back road at dusk. The fencing was visible through the trees, gleaming faintly in the low light. And beyond it, farther back than the old sign had ever been, I saw movement. Not fast, not dramatic. Just someone walking parallel to the fence line, matching my speed. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look directly at it again. Because I'd learned something else by then. Curiosity is consent. And acknowledgement is invitation. That was the end of case 1. Not because it resolved, but because it completed its function. The disappearances didn't stop. They redistributed. Different counties, different states, same spacing, same patterns, and always, the first ones affected were the people trained to search. That sounds small. It isn't. In search and rescue, documentation is survival. Logs, times, coordinates. You write everything because memory lies under stress. And paper doesn't. When something goes wrong later, the log is the only thing that proves you were where you said you were, that you followed protocol, that you didn't imagine it. I'd kept a private notebook for years. Not official reports, just observations, weather quirks, radio anomalies, things that didn't quite fit but weren't worth escalating. After Hawkville, that notebook stayed empty. Not because nothing happened, because writing felt like answering. The last entry I made was the morning after Eli disappeared. Just one line. Audio anomaly now present outside operational zone. I stared at it for a long time before closing the notebook and locking it in the glove compartment of my truck. I didn't burn it. I didn't destroy it. I just stopped adding to it. That same day, I was asked, unofficially, to come in and clarify a few details about my involvement in the Hawkville response. Not an interrogation, not a formal interview. A conversation. It took place in a borrowed office in the county building. No recording equipment, no nameplates. Just 2 men I hadn't met before, and a woman from the state who introduced herself only by her first name. They asked about the voice. They didn't call it that. They called it perceived auditory stimulus. They asked if I had a history of sleep disruption, anxiety, or stress-related hallucinations. I answered honestly. Then one of them asked a question that didn't fit the rest. Did you feel compelled to approach the tree line? I looked at him. What do you mean? Not logically, he clarified. Emotionally, I thought about the moment at the sign. The way my feet had shifted without me deciding to move. The way my body had leaned forward before my mind caught up. Yes, I said. The woman nodded like she'd expected that. Did you resist it? She asked. Why? I didn't answer right away, because it felt rehearsed, I said finally, like something waiting for me to step into a role. That was the wrong answer. The conversation ended shortly after. They didn't threaten me. They didn't warn me. They thanked me for my service and told me I'd be contacted if further clarification was needed. I was never contacted again. My access credentials stopped working 2 days later. No explanation, no notice. Just revoked. That's when the 6th unwritten rule became clear. Once you notice the pattern, you are no longer an asset. You're a variable. I tried to go back to normal life. I really did. I took extra shifts, avoided the woods, stayed in well-lit places. I varied my routes like the man on the phone had suggested. Different grocery stores, different gas stations. I never left and returned at the same time 2 days in a row. For a while, it worked. Then came the dreams, not nightmares. Nightmares are chaotic, emotional, loud. These were instructional. I would dream of places I hadn't been, trailheads I didn't recognize, gravel pull-offs, stretches of forest that felt wrong in a familiar way. And always, somewhere in the dream, there was a boundary, a line I knew not to cross, and every time the dream ended the same way, with me standing still, not trapped, just waiting. I woke up each time with the same thought already formed in my head. It's patient. The final confirmation that part 1 was truly over came a week later. I was driving home just after sunset, taking a route I hadn't used before. Rural but not isolated. Farm fields on one side, a thin strip of woods on the other. I saw him before I understood what I was seeing. A boy. Standing at the edge of the trees, about 8 years old, maybe 9. Dirty clothes, bare feet. He was facing the road, but his head was turned slightly, like he was listening to something behind him. I slowed instinctively, then I remembered the rule. Children don't appear alone in places like that. Not anymore. The boy looked at me and smiled. Not scared. Not lost. Expectant. I kept driving. In the rearview mirror, I saw him step back into the trees. He didn't wave. He didn't run. He just disappeared between the trunks, like he'd been there long enough to know exactly where to stand. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone, because by then, I understood what reporting did. It didn't stop the process. It fed it. That was the end of case 1. The point where it finished learning the basics. How to present, how to escalate, how to test resistance, and most importantly, how to move on from the forest. What came next wasn't louder. It wasn't faster. It was broader. And it started targeting people who never set foot near Hawkville at all. People who only shared one thing in common. They knew how to look for the missing, and they didn't realize yet that the system had started looking back.